Hello and welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. Now, I think, having spent this week researching him and looking into him, he is probably one of our most significant kings, and yet few people could actually tell you anything he'd done, and that's Henry I. So today, Derek and I are going to look into Henry I and find out who he was and why he was so significant. So I suppose I should give you a brief introduction to Henry I. He was a Yorkshireman, our only English king who's a Yorkshireman. He was born in Selby sometime in 1068, and he was raised in England. A son of William the Conqueror, who was born and raised in England. Henry I was born and raised in England. He was very well educated, a fourth son, so some suggest he was intended for the church, but I haven't seen any evidence of that. But he was more educated in reading and writing and literacy than his older brothers were, who seem to have been taught little more than fighting. And he was knighted in 1086 at the age of 18 and comes across as very much the baby brother, except for one thing. He did have a lot more ambition than his older brothers, I think. So I suppose that leads us into my first question, which is, how did Henry I get on with his siblings before he came to the throne?
Yeah, not very well.
Well, I think he tends to play them off against each other, I think, and sides with the one who can give him best advantage.
We should, I suppose, mention that the main siblings we're talking about are his elder brothers, Robert and William. Robert's the eldest son, and William's the next son. There is another son, Richard, who died. But Henry is, there's this tale that Robert and his mates, his baronial cronies, were playing cards or having a drink or whatever. I mean, I should preface this by saying that it might well have come from a not very reputable source, but the story is that anyway, that Henry decides that his brother's a bit too po-faced and a bit too grown up, and so he decides to tip a chamber pot over him and his friends. Now, this is 1077. This story is attached to, but around about that time, I mean, he's only going to be about 8 or 9, isn't he?
Yeah, he's 8 or 9, and I
8 or
think
9.
Robert was about 12 years older than him, 14 years
Yeah,
older
there's
than
quite
him.
an age gap.
So Robert's in his early 20s.
Yeah, and if anybody listening is in their early 20s and they have a brother of about 8 or 9, then there's a gulf between you, really. I mean, you're on different planets. You have different interests, different social circles and activities, and so even in the 11th century, I think there would have been a huge gulf of
Yeah.
experience between Henry and his two older brothers. And so these stories of them not getting on, I think it's sort of irrelevant in a way, because that's kind of life. It's not that those two were at loggerheads all the time. And as we see later on, and as you said to start with, it's more a question of Henry maybe veering towards supporting one brother when he feels that's the best way of getting something,
Definitely.
and not so much adhering to one brother or the other permanently. And I think that shows up quite a lot in what he does. But he is, I mean, he's a son of William the Conqueror, so you know he's keen to have the best and the most he can. And if you're a younger son, you start at a disadvantage, obviously.
Yeah, you've got to make your own way in the world. And I think out of the 3 surviving sons of William the Conqueror, the one most capable of making his own way in the world was Henry.
Yeah.
We'll just go through them. Robert was the oldest. He was about 12 at the time of the Norman conquest, and he had already been recognised by William as the heir to the Norman lands, to the Duchy of
Yeah, that's
Normandy.
right. Yeah.
But he and William didn't get on. They spent most of Robert's adult life feuding with mum Matilda of Flanders playing the referee. And when she died, they just went all out hating each other.
But I mean, Robert had challenged his father before she died, hadn't he? And
Yes.
Robert, I mean, it's kind of, this is again not an unusual dynamic that the eldest surviving son, in this case Robert, is a bit at odds with his father. If you think of the
Mm,
personality of his father, William the Conqueror, I mean, he's not a shrinking violet, and Robert is has got that kind of drive, but maybe not
yes.
the ability to and personality to match it.
Mm,
And it seems to me that as long as his mother was alive, Matilda of Flanders, then she sort of perhaps favoured him a bit more than the other two, but she kind of poured oil on troubled waters and settled things. But when, as you say, when she died, that kind of removed that break on
yeah.
their friction. So
I think it just goes to show what William thought of Robert in that he didn't leave England to Robert. The problem for William was he totally wanted to disinherit Robert. The problem was he'd already had him identified, recognised as the heir to Normandy.
yeah,
And Normandy had already established primogeniture. The eldest son inherited. So there was no way he could stop Robert inheriting Normandy short of killing him.
yeah,
But he could stop him inheriting England, which didn't have primogeniture. Eldest son inherits no matter what.
yeah.
So he could leave England to William II, William Rufus, but he had no choice with Normandy.
Did he leave England to William specifically? Was that in some way
I
indicated?
can't remember the source offhand. Oh, it was his. Sorry, what am I saying? It was his will.
It was, that's what I was trying to. Yeah, it was in his will.
No, he left it in his will.
Yeah.
Henry didn't get any lands. He got,
Didn't he get some lands in a couple of counties?
yeah, he got his mum's lands in England, which were
Yeah,
worth
yeah,
£300, but he never actually managed to get hold of those because William Rufus kept them for himself.
yeah,
And his father left him £5,000. But then in 1088, he bought a large chunk of Western Normandy, the Cotentin, which included Mont Saint Michel, from Robert for £3,000.
yeah.
So he managed to get himself lands by buying them with the money his dad had left him.
That turns out later to be a bit important, doesn't it? The fact that he has this large area of land in Normandy, that
Mm.
Henry has it. It turns out later on, it gives him a bit of leverage
Yeah,
later.
it gives him a land base,
Yeah,
and it also means that he's in Normandy most of the time, and he actually becomes an influential councillor for his older brother Robert,
yeah.
and he's one of the ducal councillors. But then Robert tries to claim the crown in 1088 from Rufus, and that doesn't go so well.
No.
And one of the co-rebels was Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, William the Conqueror's half brother.
Yes, that's right.
And Odo started dripping poison into Robert's ear and saying that Henry was betraying him.
Not literally poison, presumably. We're not talking Hamlet here.
Well, no, he's basically telling Robert that Henry was plotting against
Yeah.
him. So Robert actually has Henry arrested and keeps him in prison for about a year.
Yes, that's right.
But then there's a revolt in Rouen and he sort of needs Henry's help.
Yeah.
And the revolt in Rouen in 1090 actually makes Henry's name and ruins Robert's, to be honest. It's led by some merchants, and now a man called Conan
Yeah.
leads the rebels, and Robert flees. He runs out of Rouen and goes and hides in a church. Whereas Henry, on the other hand, runs towards the fighting, takes control of Rouen, and throws Conan off the tallest tower of Rouen Castle.
I'm guessing that doesn't do Conan an awful lot of good.
No, no, he's dead, and the tower's renamed Conan's Leap.
Yes, that's right.
So poor Conan. But it makes Henry's name. He's not seen as vicious or anything, just as determined, strong. And apparently, most people saw Conan's death as justice. It wasn't that he was being gratuitously violent or anything. It was.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've ever heard anyone say that throwing somebody off a tower is not gratuitously violent. But however, anyway, that whole period, that little period, changes the dynamic, therefore, between the three brothers, and we see that Henry goes back to England, doesn't he? And somehow during the rest of William's reign, he appears to get a lot closer to his brother.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. The year after, in 1091, Rufus then invades Normandy and Robert sues for peace. And they basically divide Normandy between the two of
Hmm.
them to the exclusion of Henry. They end up besieging Henry in Mont Saint Michel. So he actually loses his Norman lands and has to go back with William Rufus to England. But there's one bit in this which actually becomes something that is of a bit of a legend with Henry. The people of Domfront decide that they've had enough of their current lord, and they invite Henry to come and take over Domfront. I think it was Robert de Bellem was their current lord, who has got a bit of a reputation for,
Yes.
actually a major reputation for cruelty. His mother, I think, was Mabel de Bellem, who is said to have killed babies and things. So he actually promises the people of Domfront that he will always be their lord, basically in perpetuity, and he will never give Domfront away to anybody. So even when he has no other lands in Normandy, he's got Domfront.
But ironically, losing his Norman lands at that point and going back to England with William,
Mm,
ironically, that puts him in a much better place when William dies because he's actually in England. He's one of the crowd, the royal crowd. So he's a have rather than a have not at that point, and he's included in the royal circle.
mm,
Whereas before that, he would have been outside the royal circle.
yeah.
I mean, he's still got the blood, obviously, but it's a lot more difficult if you're not in England
Mm.
and you're not in the royal circle to get baronial support.
And that's the thing. I mean, after 1094, he stays with Rufus and they're friends and allies. Rufus gives him back the cotton tan when Robert
Yeah,
mortgages Normandy to him. So he's got his lands back. He's got his brother William on side. And then, of course, Robert goes off on crusade in 1096, probably to prove he's not a coward after
yeah,
running and hiding in a church in 1090. But it means that he is the only one who's best placed to act
yeah,
when
yeah.
Rufus dies in 1100 in, shall we say, a rather convenient death.
Well, people have talked about it for forever, haven't they? Really, the death of William Rufus. In case anybody doesn't know, he was shot in the chest by an arrow fired in the New Forest by Walter Tyrrell, one of his close circle. They were hunting. Walter Tyrrell was aiming at a deer and missed
Mm.
by whatever means. There's a lot I find quite disturbing about the whole story. His elder brother Richard was killed in a hunting accident. So I mean these things did happen. So that's not in itself surprising. What I find surprising is what happens afterwards.
Mm.
Because Walter Tyrrell, he's done the deed either by complete accident or deliberately for some reason, and then he scarpers. He goes because killing a king is not really a very good idea. So he goes to France,
Yeah.
but then the other guys, Henry and all the other people hunting. They come back. Oh, look, William's dead. Oh, well, never mind. They ride off and just leave his body there. I mean, that's what staggered me about the story. Not the fact the king was killed or how he was killed, but the fact they just go off and leave him, his dead body there, and it's sort of found by a forester or whatever, and days
Mm.
later it's taken in a wagon to Winchester, I think. But
Yeah.
clearly there is no particular love between Henry and William. I mean, however it happens, you do not leave the dead body of your brother in a forest on the ground and go off.
Unless, of course, he thought somebody else was going to take care of it because he's got to get the treasury. So he may have done a throwaway comment over his shoulder as he was legging it to Winchester. Can somebody take care of my brother?
Yeah, but even if that happened, that's a last minute sort of, oh, can somebody deal with the dead body?
Yeah.
Not the dead body of my beloved brother, but this corpse which is lying
Mm.
around there. Can you tidy it up?
But then I think it's significant that, I know I'm going to jump ahead a bit, but on Henry I's deathbed, he actually ordered the five earls who were present with him when he died that they were not allowed to leave
Yes.
his body
Yeah.
until he died in France, and they were not allowed to leave his body until after they'd escorted it to burial at Reading Abbey in England,
Yeah.
because his father and his brother, as soon as they died, everybody left them.
Yeah.
And he was determined that wasn't going to happen to him.
Yeah, but if that was the case, he's the one that left the body of his brother.
Yeah, both of them. He
Yeah.
was at his dad's deathbed as well. So he was.
So, I mean, yeah, he doesn't get a great deal of credit in my book for that. But I mean, yeah, so whether in some way Henry engineered this death and plotted it, or whether he just took advantage of this freak accident, one way or the other, in a sense, it doesn't matter too much because what he does is he immediately moves on the throne. He goes to
Mm.
Winchester, seizes the treasury, which is obviously important. And
And what I didn't realise, he had the barons actually elect him at Winchester as well. All the barons present, they held an
yeah,
election.
but there were only a few barons there.
Yeah, everyone who'd been on the hunting trip.
There are only a few, but we're not talking about a sort of huge number of barons. That's what I'm saying. It was the people who were
Mm.
with him hunting round the king. So clearly some important people, but not all the important people.
No.
So he just got it done, basically.
Mm.
And then, it was then up to everybody else. And William had been an unpopular king with
Yes.
certain important interests, notably the church.
Mm.
And Henry, in his coronation charter, immediately starts to distance himself from his predecessor and the
Yes.
policies of his predecessor, in particular with the church, because he knows the church is very powerful. It's easy for us to forget
Yes.
now that he was living in an age when the church was the biggest multinational in the world. It was hugely powerful. And, you ignore it at your peril, as his brother found. We won't go into that. So Henry becomes king. But then he's got, of course, another brother, his elder brother. So that's not possibly going to be an easy thing to sort out either.
No, and Robert, Robert was away on crusade at the time. He was actually on his way back home from crusade.
Yeah.
He had managed to redeem his reputation as well, for the most part, by crusading. But he was on his way home from the crusade when Henry seized the throne. And it's like, so he gets back to it's a done deal. Henry's King of England, and he's slightly miffed.
I think he's more than slightly miffed.
Yeah. And decides to try and invade England and seize the throne, which doesn't go very well for him. I think it must have been really annoying for him that his baby brother was more intelligent, better educated, and had such a fantastic calculating mind. He had no chance.
Yeah, I mean, also, Henry's, I think we tend to forget because it's so long ago, we tend to forget personality as being a relevant
Mm,
factor. And I don't think there's much doubt that Robert's personality was not that attractive to others. Great soldier, a very good soldier, but not a very impressive character.
yeah.
Whereas Henry, as we've already hinted, I think, he had courage, he was dependable, he thought things out. And if you're thinking, well, who shall I support here? Well, Henry seems a safe pair of hands. But of course, there's another dimension which, again, is difficult in the 21st century to bear in mind. And that is because of the Norman conquest, virtually, well, a lot of the barons had lands in both Normandy
Yes,
and in England. So,
they did.
on the one hand, you've got Robert, Duke of Normandy. On the other, you've got Henry, King of England. And the same barons owe fealty to both of those men. So
Yes.
if one says, right, lads, we're going to invade England, take the throne, and the other one says, well, yeah, we need to defend England against Robert, you're in between a rock and a hard place, aren't you? Really?
Yeah, and that happened an awful lot. And the barons, if there were, I mean, I'm going on my research with the Warrens, if there were two brothers, then they literally split the lands. One had the lands in England, one had the lands in Normandy,
Mm.
in order to make sure that they didn't have to serve both rulers, because you can't serve two.
No.
But it still, and it also meant that whoever was on the winning side could look after the interests of their brother who was on the losing side. And you do see this with the
Yeah.
Warrens, with the Beaumonts. Most of the big noble
Yeah.
families had to split their lands.
Well, it was a way of negotiating this difficult political
Yeah.
situation. And that's what people do. That's what powerful people do. They find a way to get round problems. And this was a big problem for them.
Because what was ideal for them was one ruler for both,
Yes.
like they'd had under William the Conqueror.
Yeah.
And I think that's where Henry wins out, because he realised that. Well, at first, it's Robert who invades England, and they come up with these two armies facing each other at Alton.
Yeah.
And they decide, actually,
Yeah.
let's not fight, we'll make a deal. And Henry's very
Yeah.
generous to Robert. You know, he offers him a pension and he says, actually, if you like, I'll rule Normandy and you can be its duke, and, you know, you'll have no responsibilities. But I think Robert's still got his eye on the ultimate prize by that point. So he agrees to the treaty at first, and then makes a hash of actually coming back to England to try and make a deal with Henry for the sake of his barons, who've all been disinherited from her English lands. And Henry says, I didn't invite you to England, so I'm going to stop your pension and send you away.
I think in those early years after 1100, Henry is building a lot of bridges with important influence groups. Mentioned the church. So if I remember rightly, the Archbishop had been, he was out of the country under the last years of William.
Yes, Anselm.
Because there'd been a big dispute. Anselm, that's right, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he came back. Henry invited him back, and for a time they managed to settle differences with the church. But also in his coronation charter, I think he reinforced the importance of property rights and the barons being able to ensure that they held on to their lands, which is obviously the most important thing in every baron's little
Yes.
head. There'd been a kind of charm offensive from Henry in those early years to perhaps win over any wavering barons that there might have been who were thinking, well, perhaps Robert, it should really be king. So I guess all that's going on a bit in the background. So when it comes to Robert sort of challenging Henry, I think Robert's in a weaker position. Henry's actually in England. So I mean that makes life easier. It wasn't impossible that Robert could have taken England, but I think it was made more difficult by his lack of support
Yes.
in England. If you want to take a country and you've got lots of support in that country, then you've got a chance. But I don't think he had that much of a chance, really. And then he was defeated in Normandy, wasn't he? Henry went to Normandy.
Yes, Henry invaded Normandy in 1105, I think it was, and
Yeah.
defeated Robert in 1106 at Tonchbray.
Yes. Yeah.
A castle had been under siege, and Henry went to relieve it. Robert was defeated and captured and sent off to imprisonment in England. And that basically meant Henry had Normandy as well as England. And the other thing with Henry from that point on was his foreign policy was, it wasn't expansionist. He sought to safeguard his frontiers and unite England and Normandy and go back to the frontiers that his father had, rather than trying to expand further into France like the Plantagenets would do.
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast, actually, and it maybe explains why Henry was successful, one way in which he was successful, because he perhaps realized that after a bit of a tempestuous reign of his brother William, and the doubts put into the whole country, both countries, by Robert's rebellions, that maybe what what they needed was stability, and therefore he that's what he did because it was the best thing to do. to secure what he did have.
Yeah.
And by then, I mean, he had both England and Normandy, so you know
Mm.
maybe that was enough. I mean, again, we forget that Normandy was quite fragmented, and we tend to think of things as a whole unit, indivisible. But Normandy was made up of loads of lordships and things,
Yes.
well, like England was.
Yeah.
But I mean,
But they were all
there
semi-autonomous.
were elements of frontier towns as well, weren't there, with France?
Yeah, and with Anjou as
Yeah,
well, which we always think of Anjou nowadays as this small county, but no, it was really powerful.
a powerful player. Yeah, yeah,
And it was on the borders between France and Normandy. That was the killing ground sort of thing.
yeah,
But I think
yeah,
what Henry did was he was a good soldier. He was a good
yes,
general. He was very capable as a soldier,
yeah,
as any medieval ruler had to be. But
yes,
fighting was a last resort as far as he was concerned. And I think he
mm,
could do that from a position of strength because he knew he was capable of
yeah,
doing it. He wasn't avoiding fighting because he was scared. He was very capable, but he knew
yeah,
he could get more by diplomacy and strategic marriages than he could by actually
yeah.
killing everybody.
The thing is that slightly surprises me is that after 1106, as you said, Robert was imprisoned in England. I must admit, I hadn't realised. I knew he was in prison for the rest of his life. I didn't realise he was in prison for 28
Yeah,
years. I hadn't realised that because I suppose I kind of assumed that he must have died earlier because he was a lot
no.
older than Henry. But no, I mean he was a prisoner for a
Mm.
long, long time.
Thinking about that, he didn't die until 1134. So when
Yes.
Henry I had his barons swear oaths to his daughter Matilda, he had them swear twice to uphold
Yeah.
Matilda's claim to
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
throne. His brother was in England at the time with an even greater claim to the throne, but he's
Yeah.
just not even mentioned.
Yeah. So I was a bit surprised. I am a bit surprised that Henry didn't have him killed, to be
Mm.
honest. But there must have been some reason he didn't have him killed.
I think it was that there was no point. Robert's son, William Clito, was only a child when his father was captured.
Yeah.
But then 10 years later, he was the one fighting for Normandy, trying to get
Yes.
hold of Normandy. And
Yeah.
while Robert's son was still alive, there was no reason to kill Robert.
Well, not only no reason to kill him, but if you do kill Robert, then you make William Clito the heir, as it were,
Yeah,
who could say, "Well, I'm the heir."
yes.
Whereas if Robert's still alive, he might be the heir, but he's not. He can't make a claim. He can only act on behalf of his imprisoned father. So I guess there's some sense in that.
And Clito didn't die until I think it was 1128 to 1129, sometime around there.
Yeah. So Henry then has established himself as king. Aside from meeting the challenge of Robert, what were the other problems that Henry needed to deal with in his reign?
Henry actually set them out himself in that coronation charter.
Yeah, yeah,
Apparently, every king issued a coronation charter, but Henry's, it was basically the basis of his coronation oath, and Henry's was the first one that was written down. Interestingly, it was also the one that was used as the inspiration behind Magna Carta
yes,
in 1215. There's great
yeah,
similarities in that it's
yeah.
trying to remedy the abuses of officers, establish the position of the church in England, and try and right the wrongs of the previous reign.
But didn't it also hark back to Edward the
Yes,
Confessor in the
yeah,
Saxon period?
because what they a lot of the people of England said they wanted the laws of Edward the Confessor back because they were fairer
Yes.
than the laws after the conquest.
What, Norman law's not fair? I can't believe that.
I think a bit of it is the harking back to, like when I was a teenager in the 80s, it was like the 60s was a better time. So,
Yeah, it was always better in the past, wasn't
yeah.
it?
So I think harking back to Edward the Confessor was like, well, that was a time when everybody was at peace, everyone was happy, and it's like, yeah, you do remember the Vikings were invading, the Godwins were trying to, and there was that war with Wales. But yeah, let's say that everything was at peace at the time of Edward the Confessor. We'll hark back to that.
But I think it refers to the laws of Edward the Confessor and his
Mm,
father, though, William the
yeah.
Conqueror, doesn't it? So it kind of it's not sort of chucking aside the
Mm,
Norman inheritance, but it's
yeah.
oozing continuity and stability, which I think runs through Henry's reign, is a thread that runs through it.
Yeah, and I think also he is the one who tries to unite or bring under one umbrella the Norman invaders and the Anglo-Saxons who were already in England. He marries a descendant
Yeah.
of Alfred the Great. He marries Matilda of Scotland, whose mother is Margaret of
Yeah.
Wessex.
So that, I mean, that in itself is an important thing we should say, of course, for a king, unless you're William II. It's important to marry, to have an heir,
Yeah.
so that there is not only stability for now, but people can see
Mm.
stability for the future
And his
in
heir
your
is named
heirs.
William after William the Conqueror, but he's also given the title of Atheling, which
Yes.
is the Anglo-Saxon term for throne worthy,
Yeah.
as recognizing him as the heir to the throne.
Yeah, it's called William Adelin, or I think.
Mm,
Yeah, so there's that kind of continuity with the past, and I think a lot of successful kings tend to do that. They draw a thread between what they're
mm,
doing and what people in the past who are either revered or respected also did. So they're kind of saying,
yeah.
"I'm in that line. I'm one of those sort of people. You can trust me."
Mm.
Yeah, so the marriage with Matilda of Scotland, who amuses me. She was called Edith, wasn't she? And they changed her name.
Yeah, they changed her name because it wasn't Norman enough. Apparently, Edith is an Anglo-Saxon name, so it was like
Yeah, and I
she's
read somewhere they changed it to his mother's name,
yeah.
obviously, Matilda of Flanders.
I was at a school talking about the anarchy, and I says, and there was, there's so many Matildas, and I said, just spare a thought for Henry the First. His mum was named Matilda. He had a sister called Matilda. He had a wife called Matilda. His legitimate daughter was called Matilda. He had three illegitimate daughters called Matilda.
Yeah, but all of that is his own fault. Apart from his mother's name, it's all his own fault.
Yeah, well, I suppose if you've got a problem with names, it's easy, isn't it? You go into a room and
Yeah,
all the women are
yeah,
called Matilda. You're not going to get their name
yeah,
wrong.
yeah. Just don't call Matilda.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And no thought to historians of the future who have to write books about these people,
well,
Um,
exactly.
I
Yeah.
had 12 Matildas in Women of the Anarchy, and I think I've got even more in Princesses of the Early Middle Ages, thanks to Henry.
There's just too many of them, really.
Yeah. So he was the first one, I think, who we could see the term new men. His administration, he actually used people who were capable of
Yeah,
doing the job. And he gave the job, rather than just giving it to the lords who were there, he actually picked men who were capable of doing the jobs to
yeah.
run in the treasury, the judiciary. And it meant that he set up this really efficient administration system that would serve the later generations really well.
The way he went about it was very, very different from
Mm,
either his father or his elder brother William. And I think he, as you say, the first, or not, if not the first, then one of the first to use people who were capable, and some of them churchmen, obviously, and
mm,
churchmen had been involved in royal administration for a long time.
yeah,
Because they were educated, because they could read and write, you needed churchmen in the fold. But the church was a thorny issue, wasn't it? Even though Henry had said, he wanted to improve relations with the church and so on, there was a kind of underlying issue with the church which would rumble on forever.
yeah. And it wasn't.
Yeah.
an Anglo-centric issue as well. This was a European-wide issue.
Yeah.
And I think we have touched on it before.
Yeah.
It's called the investiture controversy. And it was basically the Pope, the papacy, and the church insisted that they had the right to invest
Appoint bishops.
prelates,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
bishops, archbishops, priests, that it was their job and that it was outside the responsibility
Yeah.
of the individual
Yeah.
countries. Of course, the kings didn't like that because that means that the churchmen in that country hold their allegiance to the Pope rather than the king.
And I think it's important to stress that a bishop was not just a spiritual person. He had a temporal role. He controlled, in some cases, enormous areas of land as a baron would.
Yes.
So in England,
Mm.
the bishops were they were effectively barons. So as you say,
Yes.
what it meant was that some of his more powerful landholders didn't owe allegiance so much to him. They owed allegiance to the Pope who had appointed them or had agreed to their appointment. So,
Yeah.
it becomes, one could see why it's more of an issue for kings when you stress that aspect of it. That these people are key members of society and key members of political society as well. Very important.
Yes.
So that's a thorny issue.
And of course, the king wanted bishops and archbishops he could work with.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
if the appointments were coming from the papacy without actually consulting the king, then he would get people in place who he couldn't work with.
Do you think that may be why he chose some of his advisors and administrators from outside the church?
Well, it makes sense, doesn't it?
When
You
we,
don't want the church to have everything in their hands if the church are going to then disagree with you and, you know, hold the country to ransom because they've actually got their hands on the administration.
yeah, that struggle between church and state, as you say, it wasn't just an English thing. It was something across Christendom, and that would rumble on for a while.
And it did rumble on for a long time.
Yes.
For Henry, it led to a dispute with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm. They initially came to an agreement, which was, we'll talk about it later.
Yeah.
Let's just get on with things and put that aside. But then it kept rearing its head, and Henry wanted to be able to invest priests. But Anselm did agree with Henry, but the Pope had prohibited it. So Anselm had to say, I can't do it because the boss has told me not to. So he ended up leaving England and going into exile in
Yeah.
1103. And it was actually
He'd only just come back from exile.
he'd just come back from exile after in 1100 after
Yeah.
William Rufus had died. But he went back again in 1103, and it was actually Henry's sister, Adela of Blois, the future King Stephen's mother, who arranged a meeting with Henry and Anselm and managed to get them to discuss between them how to come to a compromise.
The thing that people probably listening might wonder, well, why did it keep cropping up? Is that every time a bishopric became vacant, it became an issue again because it was, who was going to appoint them and
Yes.
so on. So it was just a recurring problem because in practice it kept happening.
And the thing is, when a bishopric was vacant, the revenues actually went to the crown.
Yes.
So it was in the king's interest to keep the bishopric vacant as long as possible, but it was in the church's interest to appoint someone as quickly as possible because then they were getting their money. And they did need, it had to be resolved. And they eventually resolved it where Henry required his prelates to do homage to him, but allowed the church to do the investiture.
Yeah.
But like I said, it did keep going on, and I think even at the time of Becket, there was still argument about church supremacy being outside of kingdoms.
Yes. It's easy again for us to forget the power of the Pope. and the influence of the Pope across Christendom, because it's not the same today,
No.
obviously, but in those days the Pope was a key figure. You didn't want to annoy the Pope. You didn't want the Pope to be against you. Let's put it that way. It wasn't so much that you needed the Pope on your side. You just didn't want him to be against you, because that gave your enemies a possible rallying point. Because if the Pope was against you, as he was against William II, then it weakened you.
The church had sanctions they could impose on individuals and on countries, and especially with the king, they could excommunicate the king, or they could excommunicate the entire country.
Well, that's what happened in William's reign, I
Yeah,
think, didn't it?
and if the king's excommunicated, then the people hold no allegiance to him.
Wasn't it the case that in William's reign there was an interdict, or was that John's reign?
It was John's reign. There was
John's reign, there was an interdict, and if there's an interdict, it means that no services can take place. And in
yes,
theory, that means sort of funeral services, weddings, everything can't properly
yeah,
take place.
no funerals, no weddings.
Yeah,
Baptisms still
yeah.
take place, but funerals and weddings don't, and no church services.
Yeah. So it's a big thing. It's a big thing
Yeah.
because it's the other reason it's a big thing is because for the majority of people, their faith was absolute. It was
Yeah.
something which contained their lives. So whereas we can say, oh well, there was a problem with the church, it wasn't just a problem with the church. It was a problem which affected the way people saw their lives.
Definitely.
So it is important at the time, there's no question about it. He had other problems, didn't he, with Normandy still, though, even after Robert was imprisoned. There were problems in Normandy. Normandy faced, I think, some difficult times. 1108, I think there was a coalition of some of these places we've mentioned, Anjou, France,
Yes.
Flanders. They tried to pressurize Henry in Normandy because they didn't exactly surround Normandy, but they had him a bit hemmed in there. And as you say, he hadn't tried to expand his lands, but that didn't mean that he still wasn't, that those lands still weren't under threat. Again, we think of Normandy as an entity which was indivisible, but if you're Anjou, if you're France, and so on, you think of Normandy as bits that might be acquired.
Yeah, and of course there's lords in Normandy who might not agree with Henry's taxes or laws, who think, actually, if I side with Louis of France, I'm going to be in a better position.
Or they might not have agreed with Henry being Duke of Normandy as well as King of England, because you've got, we mentioned William Clito earlier, who is Robert's son, who's stirring up problems, and he's there around, I think, 1011-ish, around about that time, rebelling, stirring up trouble in Normandy on his father's behalf, but he's still a problem.
Louis of France is thinking, well, I'll get involved because the unrest in Normandy is going to be good for France. I might get some extra lands. I might, push those borders a little further.
Well, why not? That's the other thing to bear in mind. France is not the huge kingdom, the huge area that it is today. It was much, much smaller. So, France is looking to their borders to see where they might expand. And I think the other thing is, again, it's great with hindsight. With hindsight, we know that Henry held on to Normandy. It wasn't, and that he defeated William Clito and so on. But at the time, it is a bit of a crisis, and it does have problems. And if, for example, Henry had died in that period, his son would not have been old enough to succeed as an adult. So there are all those kinds of things that at the time would have been in people's mind, but which we kind of conveniently forget about now.
And he did try and alleviate those problems by marrying off his illegitimate daughters to lords in Normandy and Brittany, and to try and bring these lords on side. That didn't always work.
No.
One daughter, Juliana, was married to Eustace de Passy, and she basically rebelled against her dad, to the extent that she did try to kill him with a crossbow bolt. And when she'd got captured she escaped from a castle by jumping into a moat with her skirts flying around her. Well, yeah, I think it just shows the brutality of the early 12th century.
Yeah, and again, that's difficult. It's something we forget, and it's hard for
Yeah,
us to get
and the
into that whole dynamic really and understand it, I think.
mm,
Um,
but it's the eye for an eye justice idea that was still prevalent then.
okay, let's talk about what Henry was successful at. Um, Now, he's one of his nicknames is Beauclerk, meaning I
Mm,
think, uh, well, literally fine writer. I imagine something like that. Good writer. But
mm,
I think the nickname has been applied to him as a kind of educated king, as
yes.
in contrast to his brother and father, perhaps. And there's no doubt that we touched on it earlier, that the administration was tightened up, it was better organized. In particular, he he oversaw, and this is not something I don't think he did, but he oversaw the growth of the Royal Exchequer and the development of the Royal Exchequer as one of the main financial institutions of
Mm,
government. And again, it was not, he didn't do it, but other people suggested things and he agreed
yeah.
with them. So there were reforms there were changes there that tightened up the efficiency of government, and made income a little more consolidated, a little more reliable. Because again, one of the things that's difficult to grasp is the immediacy of government
Mm,
in the 11th and 12th centuries, where, the king literally might need to hand somebody a bag of money
mm,
to do something. Or he might need to pay him somehow fairly quickly a sum of money to do something.
yeah.
Or somebody might need to pay the king some money, some tax or whatever.
Yeah. And that was the thing. And with the exchequer, if you can keep an eye on a record of the loans and the debts,
Yeah.
you're more financially efficient and less likely to become bankrupt.
Yeah, and less likely to be taken advantage of by your barons,
Yeah.
but also able to hold people to account much more, because more things are written down, they're recorded, they're listed, So I think
Mm,
it's kind of just making the whole system more robust and efficient. At a
yeah.
time when that was not something that necessarily had been done before.
It was basically systemizing government, putting systems in place. If this happens, then you do that, and then you do that. And having rules for
Yeah,
each eventuality meant that everybody knew where they were and what
yeah,
they would get in return.
yeah. I was going to say that. Yeah,
He did the same with the judiciary, in that there were specific punishments for crimes. So if you kill someone, you're going to be executed. If you steal from the royal forest, you know what's going to happen to you. And he did set up the itinerant royal
yeah.
justices, the justices of an eyre, and they continued all through the medieval
Mm,
period, going round the country. There used to be every 2 or 3 years they turn up in a
yeah.
town and administer justice, and he was the one who set that up.
Yeah, and I think it's again something that is outside our understanding in one way, is that we have a system now where there are courts and justices, judges and justices and so on. There are different courts for different things. But in that time, one of the pillars of kingship was that you administer justice.
Mm,
But it tended to be something that was administered by somebody else and fairly randomly,
yes.
and the length of time between a crime and the justice was huge sometimes.
Mm,
And so I think he didn't solve those problems at all, but he did improve the
yes.
situation by having itinerant justices who would, as you say, periodically visit each place and
Mm,
administer justice. So he definitely strengthened the justice system. and he strengthened the royal administration. And of course, neither of those things were particularly popular necessarily. It's the same old story. I want good
Mm.
justice as long as it's for me and as long as it doesn't
Yeah.
adversely affect me. But obviously, if you're enforcing justice against me, that's a whole different matter. And if you're
Mm.
taxing me, that's a whole different matter. So it wasn't necessarily popular, but it was efficient and it was an improvement. And as
Definitely.
you say, there was more certainty involved in justice, so people knew where they were,
Mm.
and that's, I think, got to be a good thing.
Yep.
The other thing he did was he did manage to hang on to Normandy
Mm-hmm.
intact, pretty much, and he did sort of remove the threat over a period of time of William Clito, and obviously Robert was dealt with by imprisoning him, as we've said. So in terms of stability and the threats from other places, he had acted quite
Yeah.
strongly.
The marriage of his legitimate daughter, Matilda, in 1109 to the Holy Roman Emperor was a major
Yeah,
political coup, and it just shows the standing that Henry I was held in throughout Europe to actually for the Holy Roman Emperor
yeah.
to seek to marry his daughter.
The whole entity of England and Normandy is a big thing, whereas
Mm,
Normandy and England on their own are not such a big thing. So the fact that he holds together those two big areas with all the power and wealth they have means that he earns that respect
mm,
from other rulers. Whether they like him or not isn't the point. The point is they respect him, they
yeah.
respect his strength. So it sort of, as you say, it kind of puts a marker down when he marries his daughter to the Holy Roman Emperor that he's kind of arrived as a
Mm,
as a European ruler. So it is a big thing. I mean, of course, the elephant in the room is the succession,
yes.
where, shall we say, the wheels didn't so much fall off as the entire vehicle sank,
Mm, literally.
like a ship sinking in the channel.
After after hitting a big rock and going
Now
down.
we're not
Yes.
going to dwell on what happens after Henry's reign in the period known as the Anarchy. And we have done a podcast on the Anarchy. It was the very first podcast Sharon and I did. So if you're interested to know, to get into the nitty-gritty of what happened after Henry I's death when the succession crisis occurred, then you can check out that one on the Anarchy. But let's look at the issues that arrived when in 1120, I think it was.
Yep. 25th of November,
It
1120.
sounds as if you were there, Sharon.
I've covered it so many times.
Well, in brief, because as I said, we've covered it elsewhere, but in brief, Henry was in France with many other nobles. His son, William Adelin, was also his heir. Son and only legitimate son and heir was also in France, was also in Normandy, rather. And they came back on separate ships.
They just had been at war with France, basically, and they were
Yes,
celebrating
yeah,
because they just agreed a peace. William had been married to Matilda of Anjou, so
yeah.
although she was only 8 or 9 years old, so there was no. He wasn't celebrating having a new bride. He was celebrating probably.
He wasn't that old, was he? How old was he?
He was about 16, I think.
So they all came back on different ships, or at least Henry came back on one ship, and his
Mm.
son and his friend and so on came back on another one called the White Ship.
His wife went with Henry. His half sister went on the ship with him, and another half brother, Richard of Lincoln.
One of his many half
Yeah.
brothers. Yeah,
Stephen was supposed to go on the ship, but he was suffering from food poisoning, so he disembarked at the last minute.
yeah. Stephen being Henry's nephew,
Yeah.
Adela's
Stephen of
son.
Blois.
Yeah, and so yes, he was supposed to, and he only at the last minute decided not to, which
Mm.
kind of changed the course of English history. But anyway, the ship went down. In short, the ship went down with just about everybody dead.
the ship went down with
Yeah,
all souls. Yeah, apparently, according to
yeah.
Audric Vitalis, a butcher survived who'd only gone on the ship to try and get paid, and was found afterwards. He being the only one still alive.
Yeah,
Very few of the
yeah.
bodies were found as well. You know, there were 300 people on board, and they only found a few of the bodies, including one of the ones they did find was Richard of Lincoln. They've never found William.
So that we don't go too much into that whole thing. The bottom line is that Henry's succession, which was cut and dried, he had a son,
Mm,
almost and pretty much an adult,
yeah.
ready to succeed. That son was now dead. So that presents Henry with a major problem. He has a daughter, Matilda, who shortly as it happens becomes a widow because the Holy Roman Emperor dies. And so, as all good kings do, he gets his daughter
Mm,
back and decides he better marry her to somebody else. She's his only legitimate heir. Now, it's worth mentioning that there are a hell of a lot of illegitimate children of Henry I. And it's kind of one of those
mm.
quirks of history, isn't it? That it's unbelievable how many there were. Something like 9 sons, 13 daughters.
Yeah, there's at least 20, possibly as many as 25,
Yeah,
26 illegitimate children,
yeah,
but only two legitimate ones. I always wondered why he had a son and a daughter and then stopped with the legitimate children. And
yeah.
it's like, I do wonder if it wasn't because of his relationship with his brothers. He thought, I've got a son, that son is going to be king. And if he doesn't have any more legitimate brothers, there's no discussion. You know, he's got it and that's it. Whereas all his illegitimate brothers can support him as king, but they have no claim to the throne.
Isn't that a bit short sighted?
Well, in the end, yeah, it is, isn't it? But I suppose if,
I know hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I think that it's a pretty constant factor with rulers that they don't just want one
yeah.
male heir. I think,
But then as soon as they have more male heirs, everybody says, look at Edward III, too many sons, causes dynastic problems later down the line.
yeah, well, he does have too many sons, but at least he has more than one.
But I mean,
Now, look at it the other way round. Turn it the other way round. If Edward III only has one son, right? Black Prince, that son dies before him. His son, Black Prince's son, Richard II, dies without children. You're
mm,
snookered, aren't you?
yeah,
Who becomes king then? So, although Edward III is criticised for having too many sons, I would argue it's not as bad as having not enough.
yeah.
And Henry doesn't have enough.
No, Henry
Um,
certainly doesn't have enough.
I mean, I do. Having said all that, I mean, we should say that he looks after all his children. He makes sure that they have lives that are befitting somebody of status,
He does,
good
yes.
marriages or whatever.
And he recognizes
Yeah,
every single one of them. He doesn't, there's no doubt as to which are his
yeah,
children. We know who they are because he recognized them. He gave them positions and married the boys to heiresses so
yeah.
that they had lands, married the daughters to lords to strengthen his links with his own lords and foreign countries. You know, one became Queen of Scots.
So the eldest one, Robert, who becomes known as Robert of Gloucester, Robert Earl of Gloucester, who, as you say, was married to an heiress and did well out of it. He appears to be very capable, very supportive of his father, both in terms of battle and in other ways at court. And for the life of me, I mean, maybe this is me not quite grasping the etiquette of the time, but I don't understand
Mm,
why he didn't legitimize Robert when I can understand it before when William was still alive, but when William Adeline died on the White Ship,
mm,
I don't really understand why he didn't go for that option because it's not as if he was estranged
no,
from Robert. It wasn't as if it was a bad relationship and he thought, oh, crikey, I can't leave things in the hands of this guy. But instead of that, he does two things. One, as we've almost said, he marries his daughter Matilda to somebody else. That somebody else is Geoffrey of Anjou. Now, Anjou, as you said, is is a powerful neighbouring
Mm.
state of Normandy, France, and so on. So it's a fair sized place to marry your daughter off to the ruler of, but
Mm.
it's also a rival state to Normandy. So if you're a baron with lands in Normandy, and as we've already said, a lot of them have got lands in Normandy, when you think of Geoffrey of Anjou, you don't think of a potential ally, you think of a potential enemy. So whilst one could argue that it was a stunningly great move to marry Matilda to a potential enemy and therefore diffuse that. That wasn't how people at the time saw it, was it?
It wasn't. And you know the irony? William, Henry the First's son, had been married to Geoffrey's sister,
Yeah, yeah.
and no one had a problem with that. But
But she was a woman.
she was she was a woman, yeah.
Yeah,
And the problem was that they thought that Geoffrey marrying Matilda would mean that Geoffrey gets the throne, not Matilda.
yes. And also, in the years after that, even though, as we've said earlier, Henry had asked the barons or required the barons to swear an oath of allegiance to Matilda as his successor, in the years towards the end of his reign, Henry was in dispute with Geoffrey and Matilda.
Yes.
As part of the marriage settlement, Henry had agreed to give them certain castles in Normandy, and
Mm-hmm.
that didn't materialise. So, so Geoffrey of Anjou, not a shrinking violet, also he sort of decided, well, if I'm not going to be given these castles, I'm going to take some. So
Mm.
they were actually at war with other
They
Normans
were, yeah.
at the time. So it was a fractious relationship, and you can kind of see why the English and Norman barons, when Henry was on his last legs, you can kind of see why they thought, well, come on, Matilda and Geoffrey have not
Mm.
really been great friends of England or Normandy. So that's not a very good way to go in the English succession. And Matilda
Mm.
was not the only option, because Henry had
No.
kind of groomed his nephew Stephen.
Yes, definitely. I think actually between 1120 and 1125, Henry was setting Stephen up to become King of England. You know, he married he arranged the marriage to Matilda of Boulogne, who just happens
Yeah,
to be one of the richest heiresses in Europe
yeah,
and owns the port from which everybody will travel to get
yeah,
to
yeah,
England, has a massive
yeah,
fleet of trading ships, and really establishes, gives Stephen, who is actually a younger son, you know, it
yes,
gives him massive facility to, you know, it puts him on a level with the leading barons in England and Normandy.
yeah. So he does build up Stephen's influence, and yeah, and whether that accelerates because he thinks, well, okay, I've married Matilda to Geoffrey, but looking back on it, I'm not sure that was necessarily a good idea.
Mm,
His own queen, Matilda, the Scottish heiress, died in 1118,
yes.
before his son had died. But after his son dies, he marries again. He marries in 1121
Mm,
uh, Adelaide of Louvain, I think,
yeah.
who is young, but there are no children.
No, there aren't. And I think that marriage was actually arranged before the death of
Yeah,
William,
you'd think so, wouldn't
because
you?
they got
Yeah,
married something like 29th of January 1121.
yeah,
And she was she's Louvain's in the Holy Roman Empire. So it's not somebody down the road who he can just say, "Oh, shall we get married because I need a
yeah,
wife."
yeah, yeah,
There'd been arrangements being made for a while.
yeah. And that's only a few months after the White Ship
Yeah, it's two
disaster,
months
isn't it?
after the White Ship disaster.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So
almost to the day.
planned before
So
that.
must
Yeah.
have been planned beforehand. I think Empress Matilda had a hand in it as well, possibly played matchmaker, because she and
Mm,
Adeliza were of a similar age and they would have known each other because they were both in the
yeah.
Holy Roman Empire. But
Yeah.
I mean, Henry did his best. He took her with him everywhere once they were married. If he went to Normandy, she was dragged along, you know. Every 5 minutes they had a spare 5 minutes. Come on, bedroom, darlings. Let's sort, you know.
And considering the number of illegitimate children he had, I mean, it's almost
Yeah,
unbelievable that she didn't conceive.
she got the blame. And there was a suggestion that Henry set her aside, but he never did.
But am I right in thinking she did later have children with somebody else,
With
didn't
her
she?
second husband, she had 7 children.
Yeah. So
So
it's weird, isn't it?
yeah, it's just an incompatibility issue with Henry, probably.
Did he have any illegitimate children after he married her?
I don't think there were any after he married her. I think the youngest was about 1118, 11, born in 1118 or 1119, something like that.
Yeah, but maybe there was a fertility issue with Henry.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I think given the fact that
Mm,
she clearly was capable of having children and he clearly was capable of having children,
yeah.
but not necessarily in that later
Mm.
part of his life. So you never know. Could be some issue
He
there.
was in his early 50s by the time he married Adeliza. 52, 53 when they got 52 when they got married. So
That would explain it rather better. The other thing, of course, is that we think of it as binary, Matilda and Stephen. If you're a Norman Baron, you are not thinking necessarily of either.
no, they weren't actually.
Because the Normans had actually offered the throne to Stephen's brother Theobald, his elder brother,
Yes.
Theobald
Yeah.
of Blois. And it's just amusing in a way. I mean, you get a comedy
Mm,
out of it really, because as they are doing that, Stephen is off to England to
yeah.
have himself declared as king. And I guess those barons were, it was almost a situation where they heard the news almost as though they just offered Theobald the throne.
Yeah, they basically did. They were getting together to decide who would be Duke of Normandy. In the meantime, Stephen, who I think had this planned for quite a while, it's funny that he was sat in Boulogne
Yeah,
with a ship at the
sheer
ready when
coincidence.
Henry I was dying at Leon Laforet. It's like,
Yeah,
just I'll just sit and wait here for the news. As soon as he gets the news, he hops on a ship
yeah,
and he's crowned 3 weeks after Henry's death.
yeah,
In the meantime, the Normans are going, well, who shall we have as Duke of Normandy? Well, if we don't want Matilda, then Theobald is actually next in line. You know, he's the king's oldest nephew
yes, yeah, that's right.
and Count
Yeah.
of Blois. So he's in a good position. So shall we ask Theobald? Oh, somebody's just arrived. Apparently Stephen's King of England. Oh, well, then stuff that, Theobald. We're not splitting England and Normandy again.
Yes,
And that's basically how Theobald loses out of the Duchy of Normandy, because Normandy decide they want to stay with England.
yeah, because there's strength in that. Yeah,
England have King Stephen, so they stay united. Poor Empress Matilda, she had recently given birth to her second son, which
difficult birth.
was
Yeah,
rather traumatic, and she'd nearly died. And she was now pregnant with her third son. She probably thought the 2 sets of oaths
yeah,
would guarantee her succession. So she and Geoffrey, when they heard that Henry had died, the only thing they did was they moved to seize the
yeah, yeah,
castles that were Matilda's dowry.
yeah. I think they were wrong-footed, weren't they?
They didn't act decisively and lost out on both Normandy and England.
Of course, if ever there was anybody who acted fast on the death of the previous ruler, it was Henry I. So
Yeah,
do you think there's a suspicion that it wasn't accidental that Stephen was in Boulogne? It wasn't accidental that he moved fast to England to get the throne. Did Henry,
I definitely think it wasn't accidental. I don't know whether or not Henry was behind it.
but did Henry, what I'm saying is, did Henry perhaps say, look, what you need to do
Possibly.
is you need to, if I die, and of course, he wasn't expected to
Mm.
die that minute.
But he was ailing. He was ailing. He was getting, they knew it was on the cards at some point soon.
Yeah, well, yeah, he was getting old, but didn't he die from a surfeit of lamp? Isn't that the traditional story?
Yeah, that's the truth. He had intestinal issues. He'd been ill for about a week. when he died, and it was his doctors had told him he had to stop eating this fancy food.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think he more or less said, if I'm dying anyway, I'm having my lamb freezer.
Yeah, so I got a suspicion that maybe Henry had already thought that Matilda was maybe the wrong choice.
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
No, because of Matilda's son. Henry had a grandson
Yeah.
who was his, even if Matilda did a hash of it, Henry of Anjou, Henry Fitz-Empress, was going to be Henry II. I think he would have been quite happy to disinherit Matilda. I don't think he would have disinherited Henry.
Yeah, but young Henry was very, very young at that point. He was
He was
only
two,
a
yeah.
small boy, wasn't
But
he?
I don't think.
Yeah. So I mean,
Mm,
small boys die. I mean, I don't think, I just think, why would he raise Stephen up and still want Matilda to succeed?
because he wanted his blood on the throne. And he decided that in 1125 when he recalled Matilda to England. So why would he then, 10 years later, say, actually, I don't want my blood on the throne, I'll give it to Stephen?
Hmm.
I think it was more likely that it was the barons who organised this plot to get Stephen on the throne.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's for sure. I'm sure it was. Yeah. What I'm saying is, I just wonder what was in Henry's mind in that
Mm,
last year or so of his life, as to whether he thought, well, I'm not sure this is going to work out. He must have not. I mean, the antagonism between the English and Norman barons and
mm,
Geoffrey of Anjou was
yeah.
considerable. Matilda's personality was not exactly humble. I think Henry was covering all bets, to be honest.
Probably.
Because if you think what Henry was like, he was intelligent. I've always sort of wondered, did he really think that after his death, an oath to anybody was going to necessarily
Mm.
be honoured? And these, I know he did it twice. He got them to swear to Matilda.
I do wonder if it was an issue that he thought, I can't I can't deal with it anymore. Um, Let them fight it out. Because
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
why didn't he summon Matilda and Stephen to his deathbed?
exactly.
Why did he
Yeah,
leave them where they
yeah,
were? Because that is, yeah, why on earth he made sure he was surrounded. He had 5 earls with him when he died, and he made them all swear to stay with his body until it reached Reading. One didn't,
yeah,
because one of them,
yeah,
Earl Warren, actually accompanied the body to Rouen and then seized Rouen for Stephen. So that's what I
yeah.
know. The barons were all in on it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think you're right that maybe in the end Henry decided, well, whoever is strongest will survive and will endure, and so let's see what happens. And I shan't worry
Mm,
too much about it anymore. I think he'd set Stephen up as a possible successor by
yeah.
raising him up more than he otherwise would have done.
Yeah. I think if he'd known that Matilda would have been available, was going to be available in 1125, he wouldn't have given Stephen the opportunities he did between 1120 and
Yeah.
1125. He was setting, he didn't realize in the 1120s that he was setting Stephen up as a rival for Matilda. He probably realized
Yes.
it after,
Yeah.
in the 1130s, that he'd done
Yeah.
what he'd done. But at the time, he thought Matilda wouldn't be available.
And also, when Matilda married Geoffrey, he was very young. He was a teenager.
Yeah, he was only 14 when they married.
So, it took a few years for him to perhaps understand that Geoffrey of Anjou saw this as a golden
Mm,
opportunity to squeeze whatever he could out of Normandy on the way to getting
yeah.
the English
And
throne.
that's probably why he married her to a 14-year-old, because he thought he'd be able to control him
Yeah.
and train him to be somebody in his image, to do what he wanted him to do, rather than an older man who was his own man already. and he
Yeah.
didn't realise that Geoffrey wasn't actually going to be that malleable.
He didn't get the memo about the Angevins, really,
Yeah,
because they weren't they weren't that compromising, really,
yeah,
as a breed.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and nor was Matilda, to be fair.
No,
Um,
but I
but
think
yeah,
Matilda, I've got a lot of sympathy for Matilda.
yeah, so have I. Yeah,
She'd been raised as an empress. She was going to be
yeah.
imperious, you know.
Yeah, we can only put so much blame on Matilda, Stephen, anybody else, and the barons. I think if the succession basically fails, and I don't think there's any doubt that it did fail because of the problems that arose after Stephen became king, but if the succession fails, it's the fault of the king that leaves it, not
Yes.
those afterwards. And Henry didn't secure the succession well
Yeah.
enough. I mean, he had choices. He could have said, well, Stephen's going to be king,
Mm,
or Theobald's going to be king,
yeah.
or Robert's going to be king. He could have gone down a specific male route,
Mm,
but he decided not to because, as you said, Matilda was the only one of his direct bloodline,
yeah.
legitimate bloodline. But I think that was a very bad decision at the time that we're
Yeah,
talking about.
no. And I think, like you say, the question of Robert of Gloucester, apparently the church had become more strict on the inheritance through illegitimacy, which
Yes.
basically denied Robert the throne, despite the fact that Robert's grandfather was known as William the Bastard.
Yeah, exactly. There's a bit of a clue there in the name.
But by this point, the church had decided that's it. If you're illegitimate, you can't be a king. And it's unfair because I think Gloucester would have probably been the person to have.
Yeah, yeah, I think he would have been. I think he was quite well respected amongst a lot of the barons, maybe not so much in Normandy, but then he was Robert of Caen,
Mm,
wasn't he? Because he was born
yeah.
in Normandy. What's our overall conclusion on Henry? Was he a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I
Do you
think
think?
he was a good thing. He set out the administration for England and Normandy. He managed to keep the two countries united. It was a bad thing in that he failed in the one thing that every king must succeed at, and it's the
Yeah.
succession.
Picking up on Normandy, I mean, it occurred to me when I was researching this that yes, in the short term, keeping Normandy was a good thing. In the long term, it was a terrible thing because it was the cause of problems from then on, really. Because as long as Normandy was in what geographically we regard as France, and you've got all those other minor states vying for lands and
Yeah.
so on, it takes the Plantagenets, I don't know, 50% of their energy probably
Mm,
to hold on to Normandy and the other parts of the area that
yeah.
they eventually grab.
Well, you look at Richard I's reign, 1189 to
Yeah,
99. He spent 6 months in
yeah,
England. Everybody goes, "Oh, he hated England." It wasn't that. It was, yes, he spent 3 years on crusade,
yeah,
but then he spent the rest of his time holding on to
yeah,
Normandy. Because as soon as France gets a strong king in Philip II,
yeah,
he's looking beyond his borders. He wants to make France, the geographical
yeah,
France, into the Kingdom of
yeah.
France.
And of course, it's very difficult to defend lands across the channel because logistically,
Yes.
everything's got to move by ship. And
Mm,
so it is very difficult. And it becomes increasingly difficult. As you say, France gets more powerful, it gets larger, but it gets more powerful. And it sees Normandy as the prize.
yeah. And the Norman barons see the possibilities. King in England who's across
Yeah,
the sea, or the king in France who's on the border. And if I submit to him now, he's going to be more friendly towards me than if I fight him and then
yeah.
submit.
So I think in the short term, yes, obviously, I'm sure it suited the barons who, as we've said, had lands in both England and Normandy. It suited them that there was one king for the whole area, but in the long term, it was a constant source of trouble.
Yeah. He basically instituted England's policy towards Normandy for the rest of the medieval
Yeah,
period.
absolutely. And I mean, it's easy for us to assume that was inevitable, but of course it wasn't. It was only because William, Duke of Normandy, had invaded. He brought Normandy
Yeah.
with him, as it were. Whereas, just in 1065, England had no designs on Normandy or anywhere
Mm,
else on the continent. So it did change things when, well, obviously it changed things in 1066, but in Henry's reign and just before Henry's reign, there was the distinct possibility that Normandy and England would become separate entities again.
mm.
And he kept it together long enough for it to become a bit more cemented. So, good news on organising the government, bad news on the succession, and a bit of a don't know on Normandy.
Well, you also have to remember that he facilitated basically what would be the Plantagenet Empire by holding on to Normandy, and then Henry II expanding by marrying Eleanor of Aquitaine. So he was the star of the Plantagenet Empire.
Well, without the marriage of Matilda to Geoffrey of Anjou, there wouldn't have been an Angevin
Mm,
dynasty in control of England. I mean, that's the only connection they had. So, without that, it wouldn't have happened.
yeah,
So he's to blame for that as well.
yeah,
He's really
exactly.
useless king, Henry I. I don't know why we bothered talking about him.
So, having started with probably one of the best kings that we don't actually know a lot about, to, oh God, he was useless.
Well, no, I think the thing about Henry I that we should be clear about, and you have been from the start, is that he's been overlooked quite a lot because
Yes.
it's a long time ago, and most of the issues that he dealt with were transitory issues. They're medieval issues, and we don't sort of think of them too
Mm,
much today. He doesn't excite the same interest or vitriol as an Edward I or
mm.
the excitement of Edward III and Henry V. He doesn't have those things going for him, and so he does tend to get overlooked. But I think his reign's important.
Definitely. I mean, he wasn't one for conquest, he was more for
Yeah,
consolidation.
we shouldn't criticise that.
He wasn't into warfare for the sake
Yeah.
of warfare. He fought when he had to, but if there was another way, then he'd take that way. Probably that's why he's overlooked a lot, because he's not an expansionist king
Yeah.
like Henry II or William the Conqueror. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, do let us know in the comments on the podcast pages or on YouTube whether you think Henry was a good or a bad king. And join us next time when we'll be discussing my new book, Princesses of the Early Middle Ages, Royal Daughters of the Conquest. And I'm pretty sure we'll be touching on Henry I and Juliana again in that one. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks for listening. Remember that you can get hold of the podcasts on all your favourite podcast providers, as well as on YouTube. If you can, subscribe to our YouTube channel, that'd be great. And do give us some feedback in the comments if you can. And finally, do check out our very first podcast, which was on the anarchy, if you want to know what happens after Henry I's reign. Thanks for listening.